Søren Kierkegaard was a 19th century Danish writer, often considered the founder of modern existentialism and widely regarded as one of the most influential thinkers of modern times. He was born into a middle-class family in Copenhagen in 1813. Although both his parents loved him, he later described his upbringing as insane, partly thanks to his father's deep religious melancholy. In 1841, he graduated Magister in philosophy at Copenhagen University. That same year, however, was chiefly significant as the one in which he called off his engagement to a young woman called Recollection, whom he'd met in 1837, and to whom he proposed marriage in 1840. The reasons for the break are still unclear today, but his morbid upbringing must have played a part. He also seemed to believe that marriage was inconsistent with his vocation as an introspectivist and a critic of his age. Ultimately, it would have required him to make unacceptable compromises. However, he continued to love her for the rest of his life, a fact which suffused his writings. He died in 1855 at the age of just 42. The first and most basic thing to understand about Kierkegaard is that he was a Christian. All his books and essays are an attempt to restore Christianity to what he considered to be its true nature, a brutal existential challenge to each individual person in particular. He thought church and society had betrayed it, making it into an anodyne corporate affair. He began publishing as a vociferous critic of the Prussian philosopher George W.F. Hegel, who had died in 1831 but whose influence was everywhere in the 1840s. Hegel saw all of human culture and philosophy as part of an evolving spirit in which everything had its place. Religion was simply primitive philosophy, and philosophy was valid insofar as it expressed the universal. In Hegel's own words, the real is rational, and the rational is real. For Kierkegaard, that was dangerous nonsense. As against Hegel's stages of evolving human history, he identified three spheres of individual human authenticity, each traversable by a qualitative leap, not by gradual quantitative increments. His 1843 either-or considers the first two. Firstly, the aesthetic, represented here by an unnamed young person who chases sensual and immediate experiences. This isn't necessarily hedonism or romanticism. It's about limited time projects. It can't ultimately prove satisfying. The second sphere of authenticity is the ethical, represented in either-or by a character called Judge Wilhelm. The ethical is characterized by lifelong commitment to a set of ideals that transcend the individual. In that sense, it's superior to the aesthetic, but it's universalistic and, as such, tends to efface the individual's profound self-responsibility. The third sphere is the religious. It doesn't appear in either-or, but in a separate work, Fear and Trembling, published like either-or in 1843. Kierkegaard illustrated the religious by way of the story of God's command to Abraham in the biblical book of Genesis to sacrifice his son Isaac. Nothing rational can make sense of such a demand, and yet Abraham, as the perfect man of faith, demonstrated complete obedience to it. That is the essence of the religious, and it's also the essence of Christianity. We're asked to believe on pain of eternal salvation that a carpenter's son in an obscure corner of the Roman Empire roughly 2,000 years ago was actually God himself, the creator and sustainer of the entire known universe, somehow here on earth in an unprecedented, unrepeatable way, and that this carpenter's son, stroke God, was then horrifically put to death before coming back to life, apparently better than ever, just 3 days later. That's the proposal Christianity puts to us, and Kierkegaard thought it was every bit as absurd, if not more so, as God's proposal to Abraham. Shamefully, the establishment has smoothed its rough edges to such an extent that there are some Christians, of whom he identified many, who think they can make Christianity rational. They can't. In many ways, although it's not often admitted, there's a deeply mystical side to Kierkegaard's thinking here. It's strongly reminiscent of the darkness of God explored by via negativa theologians like Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, for whom there was an impenetrable darkness above the summit of Mount Sinai in the Exodus story. As far as I know, however, Kierkegaard himself makes no reference to the via negativa. In any case, the aesthetic, ethical, religious distinction is at the heart of Kierkegaard's thinking, but the reader also has to reckon with his so-called authorship. He was no evangelical in the modern sense. Mostly the meaning of Christianity couldn't be directly communicated and was best transmitted via indirect communication. He wrote his most explicitly Christian books under his own name, but others were written under pseudonyms. The editor of Either Or is Victor Eremita, while Fear and Trembling is ascribed to Johannes de Silentio. There is an obvious sense in which this mirrors Jesus' use of parables. Let your audience do the work of unpacking the moral or morals. Kierkegaard believes that human individuals are a threefold fusion of body, soul, and spirit. The spirit is the dynamic developmental principle. However, his discussions of this are rarely as clear as the reader might like. In the concept of dread, he writes, "The body is an organ of the soul, and thus in turn of the spirit. So soon as the subordinate relationship comes to an end, so soon as the body revolts, so soon as freedom enters into a conspiracy with it against itself, there unfreedom is present as the demoniacal." The demoniacal, as far as I can tell, is roughly an alternative term for the aesthetic, but I may be wrong. Another distinction one needs for understanding Kierkegaard is between the eternal and the temporal. In his earlier writings, partly as a reaction against Hegel, he's very much concerned to attack the conventional emphasis on the eternal. The eternal, he says, doesn't blow its nose or go to sleep. As such, it can never be fully human. In his later writings, he rages against the neglect of the eternal. The church has become worldly. We need a balance. Having said that, his distinction between the eternal and the temporal is far from Platonic or Gnostic. The eternal is not a pristine, unchangeable world above, as opposed to a murky temporal world of inherent corruption here below. As he puts it in the concept of dread, man is a synthesis of the eternal and the temporal. The present is the eternal, or rather the eternal is the present, and the present is full. Elsewhere in the same work, he says the instant is an atom of eternity. Then, the eternal means first of all, the future. Closely connected to this is his notion of repetition. The eternal, which in this particular context is probably designed to mean a future existence with God, contains all that has happened in the past. Nothing will be lost. So you're not compensated for past losses in some future state of blessedness. Rather, you'll get every little thing back again, perfected. Kierkegaard makes it clear that for him, that's partly connected to Regine Olsen. There's no such thing as lost love, and probably no such thing as unrequited love. All will be restored. How that's possible, he doesn't say. To me, it's probably best captured, albeit unintentionally, by Steven Soderbergh's 2002 movie Solaris, about a man whose partner dies horrifically, but who now finds himself back together with her in a way neither of them can begin to comprehend. They progress from an elemental dread to an acceptance that everything is forgiven. That process is hedged around by Dylan Thomas's powerful poem, "And Death Shall Have No Dominion." Kierkegaard's chief contribution to philosophy may be that he raises the problem of religious language roughly a century before everyone else. In religion, we're presented with the realm of complete otherness. How can we even talk about it, much less make sense of it? Kierkegaard's response is, yes, that's a very good point. So that's Kierkegaard. Initially, he's probably best approached through the secondary literature because any one of his works needs to be interpreted in the context of his authorship as a whole. I'd recommend Patrick Gardner's very short introduction, Michael Watts's An Essential Introduction, and or Claire Carlyle's Philosopher of the Heart. But that's not an exhaustive list. Good luck.